Hi, I'm your host Tim Wood. Welcome to The Natural You. This episode launch is perfectly timed for the summer solstice 2023. Kris Petersen is going to share his knowledge of Druidry. Listen up to hear about the parallels between Native American and Celtic shamanism, how their spirituality was based on natural law and animism, where every natural thing, animate or inanimate, is a being. Find out how and where we still see the influence of ancient Druids in our modern world. Hi, welcome to The Natural You. I'm your host, Tim Wood. Today I have Kris Petersen, who is a private tour guide with a special interest in ancient history and sacred sites. I'm hoping that Kris will give us some insights into Druidry and some of the aspects of how that relates to nature and how Druidry has special sites of special interest and importance to them. And Kris, welcome.
Cheers, Timothy. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. To start us off, won't you tell us a little bit about where you come from and how you got into this this job you do, and which sounds pretty like a lot of fun. And maybe you can just tell us how your journey to get to where you are now.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm in Scotland. I was born in Edinburgh, which is the capital, which is just north of me now. I now live just south of the city. More rural landscape around here, which is really my preference. So even though I was born in Edinburgh, I was lucky enough to grow up on a private country estate. So from quite a young age, I was off, in the wilderness, which was literally right next to where our house was, and
Wonderful.
Was very lucky to have very sort of trusting parents, and also the fact that it was a very safe space to be. So, from quite a young age, I was off just wandering the woods and literally being wild in the wild. And then didn't really move into the city until I was about 7.
Wow, so those formative years were strong.
Absolutely, yeah. I was just about to say, I'm sure yourself and many of your listeners will see the significance in the first 7 years. The fact that I had that opportunity was a real blessing, and I see, even though I became very much a city boy once I came into the city, as I got older, even in my early teens, the nature would always come back and always creep in some way. And then certainly once I became an adult, as I'm about to describe, it really came back in a big way, and is now literally the center of my life and my work. So moving into the city, I went to the Rudolf Steiner School in Edinburgh. If folk aren't familiar with Rudolf Steiner, he basically set up an alternative education system, along with a whole load of other stuff, which is essentially all centered around a holistic way of living, and also a holistic education based on things like the 7-year cycle we mentioned, and lots more. And basically, after the Second World War, many of Steiner's affiliates and things came over to Scotland. So there was a very strong influence of his work, and those around him, that were orchestrating these alternative views and ways of being. And it was such a perfect time, after the war, they came here, and that's what literally society was crying out for. And I was only actually in the Steiner School until I was 14. Funnily enough, another 7-year cycle. And then I went to state school for just 2 years, a normal school, as we would say. And then, because I could legally leave school, because I was 16, I did so. Because the transition was very difficult. It was mainly to do with family situation and finances, because Waldorf Steiner is private. But I'm a kind of, I never would have gone down this path if I didn't leave education, because it was really from leaving that. And having a good few years of, a fairly chaotic and confusing time being a young man, as most of us go through. It all literally, I came full circle kind of around turning 18, and reconnected with nature again. And it was my older brother who's autistic who led me to get into looking after adults with autism and various learning disabilities, which led me to going up to Camp Hill, which was one of these other communities further north in Scotland. And it's all centered around the telling stories, therapeutic and holistic crafts. So there's various workshops that folk would go through. I did some trainings with in both Native American shamanism and also what would be called Celtic shamanism, which is essentially centered around just more sort of UK based teachings.
And how and obviously Native American is a very different nature and animals and plants to here in the UK. How were you able to? What do you see as the differences there, and how do you blend those? How do you see those working together?
There isn't. I don't see that there is a difference. It's all transferable. The medicine wheel. The circle divided into four with the yellow, red, white, black.
Yeah,
these are the root races, and much more. So it's all really transferable, and through some of the research I've been doing over the years, it's a good 15 years now that I've been immensely immersed in researching all of this stuff. I've actually found complete parallels from early beliefs here to teachings and beliefs from the Native American path.
So different worlds.
So whilst they're totally separated and literally worlds apart, there are these similarities, and I think to me, a huge essence of what shamanism. I don't even like calling it that because I think that's it's a very difficult thing to put in a box for me. It's all about how everything is interconnected, essentially.
So shamanism is,
and it's amazing as well because
so shamanism is the interconnection of all things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how I would see it. And it's that was how the shaman would see things, and then shamanism would be how to learn to be in that world and function from that space.
Okay.
And it's amazing with the connections as well, in that it's something I often share because I get a lot of Americans that come on my tours, that Scotland, geologically, as a rock, if you like, was once part of the Americas.
Wow, I didn't think of that.
And it broke off and ended up floating over. The Caledonian Mountains, the main mountains in the Highlands of Scotland, are the same geological mountains as the Appalachian Mountain.
I didn't think of that, but that's right there. It's all being mapped.
Yep.
So the terrain has linked the people, and so the terrain speaks to us, and the land speaks to us, and it speaks the same language, and the two different peoples are hearing the same stories from the land.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And it's another little coincidental thing, in that connection and with the two lands is one of the most, if not the most highest totem and sacred animal to the Native Americans is, of course, the bald eagle, the great golden eagle with the white head. So on the west coast in the Highlands of Scotland, the native eagle, the sea eagle, is exactly the same, but with a brown head, but it has a white tail.
Wow.
So it's almost like this spirit of the land has been divided, but the connection is still there.
That's a great insight. And tell me, to kind of just how is Druidry, Owl or Scotland or Celtic form of shamanism? Do they have? Would you say that?
Yeah, I mean that's really how I see it. Although we don't have the indigenous teachings. There's fragments and splinters and glimpses, and as I'll hopefully divulge a little bit in this, be able to give your listeners a better picture to that. But it's essentially, what I would say, it's a form of shamanism. It's all based on natural law, our connection with nature and the cosmos, the animals, the earth, the elements, the minerals, the planets, the stars in the sky, the plants. It's all very much one and the same in that, The Native Americans are famous for saying a rock is a living thing, and that is a very animistic thing. It's animism is like animation. It's really that perspective that every natural thing from the natural world is living, whether it's animate or inanimate.
That's always been a challenge for me as a kind of biologist, and studying physiology. It was always like, well, that's the animate world, that's the inanimate world, and these are living things. But in animism, everything has some kind of vital energy or spirit, or what words would you use?
Yeah, absolutely. Spot on both of those, I think it's hard to say because we don't really know. We can't speak to the people 2,000-3,000 years ago here, but you can speak to the Native Americans and they'll happily say that flower is a being, this rock or this mountain is a being. And this transfers, to like microcosmic, macrocosmic, to small things, to big things. And this really overlaid onto the landscape essentially, and that was really at the heart of, although it wasn't a religion, and that would not be the appropriate word to use, the Druids' belief, their spirituality, was this, that the landscape, that nature is animate, and their gods and goddesses, for want of better terms, were trees, rocks, mountains, rivers. And this was their way of being and living and existing with the natural world.
And you mentioned gods and goddesses. Were those actual words? Were those the words of the colonizers that saw them and revering a tree and said, "Okay, well, that's a goddess," or or for them it was just like, "Hey, this is the tree being"?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. To us, like their labels and their concepts. To them, they wouldn't have those labels and concepts. I'm sure the concepts would be similar, are similar. But yeah, they certainly wouldn't have had the connotations that we have today as modern humans of a god and a goddess in that respect. They were literally part of their community. Parts of the natural landscape, trees, etc., were personalities literally in their community. However, the level to which they had their interconnectedness and the way they saw nature was elevated beyond ours. They through this way of seeing things, the belief is and was that nature has a sentience that is far beyond our own. So a little bit similar to various mythologies and mystery paths, and even talking Gnosticism and Christianity, of how humans are literally lesser being.
Yeah, I see that. You're very up on the history. Can you give us some sort of ideas on the origins of Druidry and how that ties in with where you are now and
Absolutely. Yeah, so we know very little about the Druids, to be honest. Most of things that are out there that we read today are very modern. The only records we have are from folk like Julius Caesar, Strabo, the Roman historian, and various others. But it's most of it is very fragmented, and a huge percent, I would quite happily say, not that I've studied all the literature, but I would confidently say a good 50 to 60% was all propaganda. There's glimpses of stuff that we can look at and say, yeah, that's likely to be true, but there's a whole lot of stuff like human sacrifice and that they were carnivores and stuff like this, which there is absolutely no evidence for. And I would purely put down to Roman propaganda because of what they were up to with the Roman Empire and all that nonsense.
Yeah, that makes sense from a historical perspective, as the victors write the history.
Indeed.
And if they didn't have written records, then how else would you, if it's all kind of handed down, and you don't have written record, then the person to write it down is the fact.
Absolutely. And it's a great point as well, because it really fits into one of the main reason why we know very little is because the Druids' whole system was based on an oral teaching. And this is another reason beyond the tiny Roman fragments, is that they weren't writing anything down, and nobody at that time, the common people weren't literate in any way, really. So this was another reason why we know so little.
And I presume the hierarchy within the Druids would obviously want to keep their knowledge sacred to themselves, so it only gets passed down to people who are worthy and who are able to do that, to keep the lineage.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm assuming that. I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, no, there's a bit of speak around that, in that it was only certain families or certain areas where people would be chosen to, because you were chosen, you did have to be chosen to go through a very lengthy education process to become a Druid. There's a wonderful documentary which I'll send you the link for, but you can easily find it in YouTube. It's called The Last Druid on YouTube, and he specifically says, this is I think it's Mark O'Brady is the guy's name. The interview was it was in the last decade, I think. I think he might have passed away by now, but he believed that he was literally the last Druid that was alive. And it's a wonderful, deeply insightful interview with him. It's about an hour long. And one of the things he says is, when the church became to a certain degree of strength, that the Druids knew that their days were done, basically. And they were told to go and integrate in society and go and join the church and join these other places and traditions, but continue, what you have learned as a Druid. And goes in to talk about how they spent 20 years to be educated to become a Druid. That was the process. Which wow. I'm sure didn't just involve learning stuff, but all kinds of initiations and getting thrown in lakes and tied to trees, God knows what.
Yeah, it sounds like, I'm sure it was quite an ordeal to get to that kind of level of education, and to have the
Absolutely.
prestige within the community must have been quite arduous. And then I'm fascinated by the integration. So, do we see evidence of this integration into the church and other areas? How do we see it? Are there emblems or signs or?
That's a great question. And this is purely from just me connecting dots and making assumptions. None of what I'm about to say I would say to take literally as fact, but there's very interesting connections, and especially here in Scotland, because of how things went in the likes of the church gaining power over the centuries. Scotland has always been on the edge of Christendom. Before Christendom was centered in Italy, it was centered in France in early medieval times. And even then, Scotland was on the edge. So it's always had this kind of threshold. And because of this, it's maintained a lot of its more ancient and indigenous traditions. And in Scotland, as in Ireland, we have what's called the Celtic Church, which there is pretty good evidence of, from at least the 1st century AD onwards, properly becoming really organized in the 4th and 5th centuries. And this was what we call the Celtic Church, which was not any form of Catholicism or any similar thing to what we might think of Christianity today, but a much more integrated, what I would see as a much more Gnostic way of understanding the church and the Christ story and all of that, whilst also being fully integrated into the more original pagan ways and the Druidic path.
So it's the Celtic Church that were the sort of where that meeting took place, and I guess from there it disseminated out into more mainstream church.
Possibly, yeah, it's possible. I think a lot of this will be, the influence is there, but it will be over the centuries. It would have become more and more subtle. I think it would be hard to say that there would have been people consciously of a lineage that were consciously continuing. However, all these symbols, like I say, are there.
Yeah.
Like a huge one, that I'm really starting to kind of understand more and more just recently is the Scottish word for church is kirk. Now the etymological root of that is circle. And right enough, the old Celtic churches were circular. And in various glimpses and fragments from the Romans about the Druids, Caesar, for one, he actually supposedly writes down eyewitness accounts in his records of witnessing the Druids doing their ceremony and worship in groves, avenues of oak trees, and also circles of oak trees. So in both of these, I see as this literal, natural, symbolic, central, sacred part of what the Druids were up to and where they worshipped, then being transferred into the church. And hence they built the first churches in a circle. And then later they became more rectangular. However, the pillars and the arches are literally representing groves of trees.
Groves. Oh, wow. So the sort of, the central aisle between the pews would be the avenue of trees.
Yeah.
And then the columns on the side of the church would represent the trees themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, it's so interesting. And what about the Celtic cross, which has the cross and then the big circle on it? Is that linked to that circle as well?
Well, it's it was the symbol of the Celtic Church, and I believe was certainly integral to the Druids. There's actually a wonderful bit of research that's been done, and a book that's been written on the subject. I think is called The Celtic Cross. The chap's called Crichton E. Miller, and he spent many years researching the Celtic Cross, and he believes that it was actually used to survey the land and the stars, in that it was a device as opposed to a sacred object just to sit and look at. And this being that the circle inside the cross actually moved. And so you could hold the cross with the circle at the other end and have your three directions pointing from you, the fourth back, and then you'd have a moving circle within that where you could measure the distances between things and the movements of the stars.
Wow, that gets pretty technical, and obviously then assumes they're looking at celestial bodies, and did the celestial bodies have a role, or do they still have a role in Druidry?
Yeah, I'm sure they did, and I'm sure they do in this animistic idea again that nature doesn't end here on Earth. Of course, they were under the sky just like we are, and so the sky itself and all the bodies within the sky were part of all of it, and massively integral. And just like many other ancient traditions, I'm sure their creation myths, etc., were no doubt connected to constellations or
Kris,
or such like.
I really love that. Nature does not end here on Earth, and it's like, we're so fascinated with our planet. It's like save, we're all like save the planet. No, this planet probably doesn't need saving. Humanity might need saving, but and even then it's all like nature is here. It's this planet, and so I just love that. I think nature does not end here on Earth. I think that's going to have to be the strap line for this episode.
Get some t-shirts made.
Yeah, there we go. Here we go. That's for your next tour. You can have it on the back, t-shirts. Bumper stickers. Watch the space. Wonderful. So, and any other symbols that would be that we might recognize in day-to-day life that might be connected to that ancient past.
Well, I think a central role was the trees. Speaking of these columns and pillars and all of this, and their avenues of oaks described by Caesar. The word Druid itself actually translates to oak knower, or knower of the oak, or could be knowledge of the oak tree. And there's that's from the
I guess the oak.
The oak tree, yeah. So that's translated from the Gaelic Scots, and then from the Gaelic Irish, because Irish and Scots they're different. They're rooted the same, but they're different linguistically. The root from Druid in Irish is da rua, which means the red god, because they worship the sunset. So there's this connection with the sun, the solar, and the oak. And as I see it, it was, that's probably just two little, nuggets in a bigger story. But I think, all the trees would have been massively sacred. And a huge part of my work has been looking at the yew tree, which is an incredibly magnificent being. And as I see it, was like the more deeper, hidden, central sort of holy of holies, or sacred of sacreds to the Druid. Because yew trees are, they're known to grow for thousands of years, whilst most other trees grow for a century or a couple centuries. Yews can grow for thousands. So to the ancient peoples, they just would have, just been amazed by them.
So they were magical in a way that they lasted that long, and they still now. I mean, you go to old churches. I'm in England, and you go to old churches, and still, particularly near the graveyards, you will find yew trees.
Absolutely.
And I guess that's a connection to that, which was found, all over the islands. So fascinating. So. And what did the yew tree have? Particular properties or significance?
Well, just to quickly, like you were saying with the churches, I think a lot of people that are looking into the yew trees, and there's not many of us, but there's a consensus that the yew trees were in these churchyards because the churches were built on Druid groves, and the yew trees were actually there before the churches were.
That makes sense.
And this one of the reasons why we think this is because the yews are very regenerative. You can literally chop a massive old yew down, and potentially a decade, if not more, later, sprouts will start to come out the trunk, and it'll slowly start to grow into a tree again. So
and that's historical precedent. I mean, many, I think, all over the world, previously held sacred sites have often been, if they've been sacked or knocked down, they've been rebuilt with the new faith on top of that, on their foundations, because they were in either a good spot or held sacred meaning to the people, so that would still keep some cohesion even with the new religion or practice.
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant, fascinating. And if you can tell us a little bit about we were talking about the integration, and I'm curious because if we can see some of those fragments still around today and we can look out for them, it helps connect us to the past. And other than the church, were there other areas where we see that in any other areas?
Something I've been looking into. So I'm just on the edge of a little town called Roslin, which was put on the world map a few years ago because of some film called The Da Vinci Code. Because we have a 14th century, a beautiful, ornately carved 14th century chapel here. That's in the movie, and you know that it's such an unusual church in that its walls are literally covered, literally dripping in elaborately carved stonework, which you just don't see anywhere else. The concentration of carvings is phenomenal. And one of the main aspect of decoration in that stonework is foliage. So it's literally like this, it's literally like personifying this sacred grove out in the forest, which, by the way, the landscape around Roslin is this rocky, forested river gorge, one of the only parts of ancient woodland left in this area. It's literally personifying, all this we're talking about. And that's something I've been slowly looking into more now is the possibility of how, as you asked, that these Druid elements have filtered into to essentially medieval society and the church, like we were talking about. And I think Roslin Chapel is potentially a huge part of that because of all this greenery, and also it's famous for having many carvings of what's known as the Green Man, which are found mostly in European cathedrals. He started to appear around the 11th century when all the major cathedrals were built around Europe, and a bunch of smaller churches as well. But nothing like in such a concentration that we have here in Roslin. To give you an example, Chartres Cathedral, which, by the way, inappropriately, I believe, and there's evidence to this, many folk have written that it was a Druid mystery school. Chartres Cathedral has 90 green men. Roslin Chapel is less than a third of the size of Chartres Cathedral, and it has 120. And these are little carved faces, usually with foliage coming out of the mouth. But could be the ear, could be the nose, could just be surrounding like a wreath. And in Roslin, we have an even deeper sort of story to it, showing that when you walk round, starting in the northeast corner where the chapel was first, where all the construction started, you have a young boy's face. He probably looks about 5 or so, little chubby cheeks, kind of cherubim, and he's got a little thin vine coming out of his mouth. And then you go around and he looks a bit more adolescent. He starts to get more of a jawline, a bit more foliage sprouting around him. And he becomes an old man. He gets a long hair and he gets a big beard. And then you get back in the central part of the chapel at one of the center pillars, and there's a skull facing the midwinter sunset, funnily enough, the death of the year, with vines coming out where the eyeballs would be and where the ears and the nose. So symbolizing this deep connection with nature and the cycles of death, life, and rebirth.
Well, thank you so much for fitting us in and sharing some of your insights and wisdom. I found it fascinating, and I'm going to be looking out for the Green Man in every little church and chapel I visit now. It's going to probably be staring out at me and jump out and have more significance, as will the Celtic cross. So thank you so much for your time and giving us a little glimpse into shamanism in the UK, which is Druidry, and hopefully we can explore that in another podcast. And I'm hoping to get a practicing Druid on, so we can actually explore the animism in more detail in the actual practice. So, Kris, thank you so much for your time. Cheers, bud. Thank you for listening. If you want to link up with Kris or find out more about his private guided tours, look up Eden Trails on Facebook. Links are provided in the show notes. Until next episode, let nature be your guide.